Okay, you're on. Oops.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Conant Show. And today is Wednesday, May 15th? Halfway through May. Wow, 2018. And it still looks like April out there. And there's still flowers on a lot of the forsythias here and there. It's kind of a real lush and green May 15 here in Woodstock and surrounds. And, you know, I haven't had a lot of sleep the last few nights and a lot of action going on, you know, in the work world and various legal battles going on and around us. And so I'm going to touch on a few things here. I think I want to really focus primarily at the beginning here a little bit about the grand solar minimum that I was talking about last week and probably a couple of weeks before that, because it is big news and it is something that we should all really be aware of, because it really directly affects our individual lives and our collective world civilization. I once mentioned that the solar records for sunspots have been kept by the Chinese culture for thousands of years, somewhere around 6,000 years. I would go even longer than that, but at least 6,000 years of continuous study of the sun and various cycles associated with it. And what we're dealing with now is what they call a grand solar minimum. Solar minimums happen all the time, but a grand solar minimum is grand. It's a big one. It's something that happens on a longer time scale or periodicity. And that coincidentally, our present solar minimum is timed up with a physical pole shift, where the actual physical North Pole, the Earth is wobbling, so we're going to get a new North Star. So it's kind of like a top. If you ever spun a top and you see a top spinning and it starts to do that little wobble, well, it's the Earth does that a little bit, and then it gets to a new orientation and settles back into its, you know, more stable cycle. While that is going on, we're also having a magnetic pole flip, so that our North Pole is going to demagnetize and then become a South Pole. As you know, or you should know, every magnet has two ends, and one is negatively charged and one's positively charged. How they determine that, I'm not really sure, but that's what gives you a North and a South Pole. And so when the Earth undergoes a pole flip, a magnetic pole switch, you have a weakened magnetic field around the planet. The magnetosphere becomes very unstable. It has weaknesses in it, and that magnetic field around the Earth is what protects us here on the surface from a lot of the cosmic rays and solar wind, you know, solar particles, from getting to the surface. Of interest, besides gamma rays, X-rays, and, you know, cosmic rays, are the UV, ultraviolet part of the visible light and invisible light spectrum. Now, the ultraviolet A, there's three groupings or three varieties of ultraviolet light: A, B, and C. They just name it that way. Anyway, ordinarily, ultraviolet A reaches the surface, and we humans are adapted, as are many, many other creatures. Everything that's alive on the surface of the planet is adapted to that solar radiation. And among other solar particles and solar radiation that we are adapted to. But of interest here for this discussion, the ultraviolet rays are, I think those are the ones that are responsible for giving us a sunburn or a tan, depending on your, skin type. And then you have ultraviolet B, which is very dangerous and is known to be a contributor to cancer, skin cancer. And then there's ultraviolet C, which is apparently very, very dangerous. And what it actually does to you, I don't know. I imagine it's just worse than B. So whatever that may be. And a lot of different YouTube presenters are tracking the various websites that supply information on these subjects commercially for airlines, for the safety of pilots, okay, things of this nature, as well as weather stations, weather companies. So you have a lot of these science products that are collated and put together and then sold as a product for the various scientific and research entities out there that need to know about what's going on with the sun, what's going on with radiation on the surface of the planet, and this kind of thing. So,
anything I can look up on YouTube?
I don't know. Is it working?
Yeah.
Can we actually get stuff on screen tonight?
Let's see.
Here we go again, folks. This is, we're producers, and we're locked out of our own producer's computer from actually being able to pull up relevant content while I'm talking about stuff. That's why the last few shows,
you're right.
I've been relying on my own little, still pictures and whatever we can get on.
I forgot, my bad.
Yeah, no, we do have issues here still to solve. Although we do have 3 cameras working tonight, which is, a vast improvement over weeks. There we go. There's Paula. Hi, Paula. And thanks, Paula Barton, for teching for me tonight. And as always, I like to recognize your input and talents.
Thank you, George.
And so, I don't mean to be, going on about this grand solar minimum business, but I was talking about strange weather events, cold ones, going on around the world. And just yesterday, Woodstock saw a pretty awesome storm come rolling through. And I don't know, but I understand that parts of the region around here, like in Saugerties, had marble-size hail that covered the ground like snow yesterday. And then down in Newburgh, New York, there were fatalities on the New York State Thruway because a giant oak tree was thrown across the northbound lane, killing a driver, possibly more than one person. Really causing havoc. So there were high winds associated with the storm that came through yesterday, as well as hail and rain and general scary-looking skies. So this is one of the things that have been predicted by the people like Steve Olson at WSO or Adapt 2030. Those folks. This is all on YouTube. I'm giving you these names so that you guys can look it up. And see some of these programs so that you get an understanding of why I'm so concerned about this particular phenomena that's going on, and it has to do with food security. And our planting season is getting off to a really, really scary, slow, terrible start here in the United States, but especially in Canada. They still have snow on the ground in a lot of places. Hudson Bay is still completely frozen. All right. When they tell you that the Arctic is melting, it's actually been growing for the past couple of months when it should be melting. It's actually been increasing in ice area and depth. The temperatures in the North Pole are still well below freezing. I think yesterday the high was something like 18 degrees below 0 centigrade. So centigrade 0 is freezing. It's not like in Fahrenheit, just so you know. It's a 2.5 degrees difference from one scale to the other. Anyway, so I guess if I were to translate that to Fahrenheit, we'd be looking at below freezing temperatures for certain. So it'd probably be like in the teens up there, something like that. I don't have a good mental calculus for going from centigrade to Fahrenheit. But anyway, it's still cold up there, and they haven't, Environment Canada hasn't updated its ice chart for Hudson Bay since last November because nothing's changed. It's still frozen. Okay? That's big news, Al Gore. All right? That's big news. And here we're talking about, how hot it is in places, that had a heat wave that lasted a day. It's really, we're not being served by our leaders, honestly, people. All right? We're not getting honest service from our elected officials and the agencies that are unelected. Why do I say that? I say that because as some of these YouTube channels are pointing out, food is going to be really hard to come by, and you might start thinking about growing your own in whatever capacity you can, because the shelves really could go bare, if not this year, certainly next year, if this pattern continues. This is the fear that a lot of these people who are, make their living studying the environment and studying sun cycles and stuff. And as the Chinese have, recorded for 8,000 years, every grand solar minimum, every one of them, saw the demise and fall of a dynasty. The Ming dynasty fell during a grand solar minimum. All right? I only say the Ming dynasty because that's the first one that comes up in my noggin here. So, yeah, it's kind of important that we start thinking about food security and, taking care of our families, taking care of each other. It's going to get real because, the spring planting, the winter wheat is messed up in the United States and Canada. The spring wheat planting is going really slow. I think, as of a couple days ago, they only had 15% of what they should normally have planted. Okay? Think about that, folks. Other things of interest. Another story I've been following is Planet X, and this might have something also to do with our weird weather and a lot of the strange phenomena going on. And the folks out there in Hawaii, a big shout out to Hawaiians. Good luck. You guys that are indigenous to the area, you know what the drill is, you know what goes on, because this is a cycle. About every 100, 200 years, the big island does erupt and makes, new land, and some land gets lost to the ocean also in these big eruptions. So, Hawaii is being transformed, and, it's kind of interesting. I kind of think about, how the Hawaiians want their nation back. There is a indigenous movement, a very real one in Hawaii, where they really just want their islands back and they want to be left alone. And I wonder if they've been making offerings to the volcano god to scrape the intruders off their little island in the sea. So that's some interesting thought there. But now to bring things back locally here, Paula, could you give me a little insight? I haven't seen you very much in the past couple of months, and I know you've been talking to various church boards and synagogues and kind of holding correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you're kind of holding their feet to the fire about their social responsibility as leaders of a community regarding
thank you, George.
different things. So I'm kind of curious, what's going on, Paula?
Yeah, thank you for asking, because I didn't want to interject too much, because the idea of going to church boards and religious organizations usually is a little bit off the beaten path of public access producers, but I think that's due to miseducation, misinformation. Basically, because my show was originally called The Whole Tooth. It was about holistic dentistry. That's how I got into public access TV. And then after a couple of years, I got frustrated with that, went to India for 4 years, and when I came back from India, I did a show on, obviously, spirituality. And then there was a DVD in my mailbox in Gramercy Park, 26 Gramercy Park, by the way, because I'm going back into litigation after our unlawful eviction. And this DVD I thought would be an hour long. It turned out to be 4 hours. And since I was in India during 9/11, I did not go through the typical conditioning that most Americans went through who were glued to their television sets. So when I saw the way the towers were coming down, I also had a screen that I projected onto a white wall. At that time, my apartment wasn't that painted. And it was huge. And so I watched, these explosions and the dustification of this building. And as I watched, it was like Kundalini was going up and down my spine. It was just like, I was just stunned. And I thought, it's just not conscionable to be talking about spirituality and not address this elephant in the room. So I switched my show from spirituality to spirituality and politics. And I'll never forget the day I went live on TV in Manhattan Neighborhood Network and say, this show is now about spirituality. And, it was like I could hardly spit the words out, politics, because I was never interested in politics before. And the idea of combining both of those, it just didn't seem to have been done. So now I would say, having, as Susan Clark, who's been a guest on Steve Romine's radio show and is very knowledgeable about law and cell towers, and she doesn't call it chemtrails, she calls it geoengineering. She said, when I was young, my parents weren't in litigation. We didn't know anybody in litigation. She goes, everybody today is in litigation. And I think about all the people around me and what Joe and I have been doing. And so I think as a result of the frustration in the courts, and as we're getting closer and closer to the end game, seeing how much fraud is in the courts, and feeling very grief-stricken and sorry for all of the people that are involved in this industry who have been constantly looking away, I'm thinking we need a higher model. And it just seems that all the different religions, if you actually go to their books, whether it's the Koran or the Vedas or the Bible, none of the books say cheating is okay. None of them say stealing is okay.
Bearing false witness.
Yeah, none of them say that that's okay. And yet, there seems to be this, to be charitable, mischievous force that's involved in distracting people, and more than that, taking those people who are committed to these books that don't say cheating's okay, don't say stealing's okay, bearing false witness and all of that, and they're all having these beautiful visions. I've been to the communities, to the Jewish community, the Christian Science, the Dutch Reformed Church. And recently I served some paperwork at Earth Day to one of the monks at the monastery on the hill. And I called him up later. That was actually a connection that came through one of your guests, George, Kathy Nolan.
Yeah.
Because when she was a guest on your show, and she was talking about the mergers and how to get around Wi-Fi to do these dedicated wires, and I took her card, and I realized at a future date I'd like to hip her more, because I was part of the first G rollout. You know, I made $5 million, and the rest of my business partners made another $15 million on the 1G rollout. And at that time, I really believed in cellular telephones, and I'm still having the fervent hope that we can get a technology where the signals are more biologically compatible. But as it is right now, the people who would probably know about that have been a little frightened, because people involved in free energy technologies have seen a lot of murders and death, and they're, not convinced that I or the Woodstock producers are robust enough to handle this kind of heat. But, I'm a spiritual person, so I believe it will be arranged in divine time, that we just merely have to set forth the intention. So basically, I've gone around to the different organizations, the Dutch Reformed Church and the Christian Science Church and the Jewish Community Center up near the Red Onion, as well as the Buddhist monastery. And I've been most respectfully received in doing a follow-up by the Buddhist monastery. They said that they passed that paperwork on to their temple. So they know it was serious paperwork. It's paperwork that comes from the Second Circuit at the U.S. Court of Appeals, and that's one of the most important circuits in the Southern District of New York, particularly as it relates to media. Then, so along with, beating the doors of all these religious organizations, giving the benefit of the doubt that most of the people on the board are probably mostly ignorant. They don't understand the technology. They don't understand the kind of side investments that are involved, that are also hooked up with the court registry investment system, which is sourced in Texas, the same place that has Pacer, that puts up all the legal documents on the internet, the same building as Homeland Security, therefore, in my eyes, a very leaky vessel. And I'm showing this paperwork and showing on its face, anybody who bothers to study it a little bit, you can see it's fraudulent paperwork. And I think Steve Romine is coming to this conclusion. I think you and Laura are beginning to see this as we relentlessly beat on these different agencies' doors and get spun round and round. A time comes to just blow the whistle and say cease and desist, and let's start to pull ourselves together and create a society of prosperity, of abundance, of creativity. Let's sing forth a message of peace, and it can start right here in the Woodstock TV studios. Right here, all of the elements exist to, we know what the problems are and how to rectify them. We all have to get over a lot of hurt, a lot of pain. There's so much abuse that has gone on. Probably a lot of the money people understand it better than we do, who have been victimized by it. But I would say we, the victims, I think to get to a place that will give more satisfaction to our souls, probably have to be the first to come to this forgiveness. Now, this is something that's very irritating to my husband, because if you come to forgiveness prematurely, before you've set up, your strategy to actually show with crystal clarity, this is fraud, And fraud never leads to anything good, can only lead to more war, to more genocide, to more hate crimes. And that's basically what I'm seeing. IP address discrimination, which we experienced here a couple of weeks ago, George, when we couldn't get a live signal out.
Uh-huh.
When the electricity went out, the backup was backing up the rotation device. Now the rotation device is dead. It's not something that's covering the needs of the community in times of emergency.
In real time.
Right.
In real time.
In real time. So right away I was able to call up Spectrum and Time. It's actually Time Warner Cable, doing business as Spectrum. So all of the franchise agreements that were set up back in '82, whenever, that's what we want to go by. We don't want to go by this new, put it up on YouTube, and now we're discriminated against because we can't even run a YouTube channel. So I was able, right here from the TV studio, to place that call. I said, I want to talk to your supervisor, and I'm pretty convinced I didn't get a supervisor. I think all along I've never been getting supervisors. I think I've been bumped over to law firms. And these law firms are probably doing a risk analysis to see how far can we push these dupes so that we can keep these investments, these side hidden investments, rolling. But this is what due process is about. This is what the Supreme Court's about. If you do have a system where you're registering your residents in the community, or whatever you want to call them, to be assets of a corporation as opposed to real living men and women, due process and the Supreme Court is supposed to shore up when that fictitious world starts to overreach and is starting to kill the real living community. So on a very practical, simple, local level, I can actually see the beginnings of, not even the beginnings, I would probably say it's even full-blown, because we are profiled and because we are fed videos according to our profile. We have different religious organizations right here in this community hating each other and being polite out in public to not quite talk about it. So at Earth Day, I found that when the Bible got brought up, it was mostly with apologies. Now Buddhism is the big thing. Now, I fully admit I know the Bible less than I know the Vedas, and I've read the Quran too when I was in India. But because that is our founding document, even Joanne Spotted Bear, the Lakota Indian that came here, was fashioning a lot of her paperwork before the Supreme Court, citing the Bible. I think it's something that we shouldn't be ashamed of. I think when the community center had its Christmas gathering, not last Christmas, but the Christmas before, there wasn't one Christmas carol sung. So they've corrected that. I think it's because we complained about it. I think we need to understand our legacy. We need to understand how to look at each other face to face in physical, right to assemble kind of thing, and not be so victimized by these robots on these computers, because they're just robots. They don't have souls, and there's a real party behind them programming them. You're on, George.
You just touched on something that I forgot I wanted to talk about, and that is this artificial intelligence phenomenon that's being really sold, a real hard sell going on here. And Paula, you were talking about touch on so many different elements of our collective condition, here in our local community, but also worldwide. And whether you have factions of churches and synagogues and mosques and and the interfaith struggles and hatreds and things that may exist, really kind of, in my mind, it's a distraction from really accomplishing anything on a civilization scale of any beauty and meaning. And
I was actually told that by one religious person. I won't say who to get him in trouble, but he said they're creating bottlenecks.
yeah, I once heard an interesting thought or phrase. It was probably in the 1970s, early 1980s. I was, very much an activist for Native American and environmental issues. And that has always kind of, where my heart was drawn for a variety of reasons. But, I had one friend of mine, I think it was Johnny D'Elia, really gifted genius of a musician. And he says to me, we know what the problems are. You don't have to be protesting the problems. What we need is solutions. Let's talk about solutions. Let's talk more about solutions. We know what the problems are. But now, in our modern technological landscape, now I saw, I wish I had written it down so I could provide you the information on which link this was. I'm going to have to go back and scan the YouTube channels again to see if I can pull this one back. It was probably the most alarming report I've seen in decades. And what it basically is there are corporations out there that have designed software to mimic human speech patterns and responses. All right? So when you're on the phone and they show you, they dial up a Chinese restaurant that is known to use this application, and you get on the phone and they stutter a little bit, they have an accent that they're Chinese. You cannot differentiate between the automated being and a real person with this software. Gets better, folks. Not only that, but now there's another corporation that has taken this intelligent software, speech software, okay, and now they have incorporated it in with a cloning device or a mimicking device. It's beyond that. Your voice is like a fingerprint, all right? Every one of us has if you were to put your voice on an oscilloscope, a signature. Okay? It has a form. It has, the timbre of my vocal cords, the sounds that it makes, the shape of my mouth. All of those add up to a kind of a fingerprint. It's unique to me. Only I have my voice. There are people who sound a lot like each other and who can mimic other people. That's like... a lot of performers that are in that. What do they call that when they're imitating somebody's voice? There's actually
impersonators.
Impersonators. Okay, so there is people who are gifted at really sounding a lot like somebody, and to the point where you really think it's that other person. This software takes in and samples. They call it sampling for people that don't know what these technological terms mean. And it takes a sample of somebody's voice, timbre and quality and all of that, and then incorporates that into the artificial intelligence software that responds and talks. So now you can have your voice on an answering machine intelligently responding to somebody who could also be an artificial intelligence-driven software, and that they'll have a conversation. And if you were to record that conversation, you could bring it into a court of law and say, well, George said this. Nothing is real anymore, folks. This is a new set of problems, and what I'm getting to here is, no, we don't know all the problems. You, the general public, you don't know the technological landscape problems that we have as, psychic, spiritual, and physical landmines all around us, whether it's IP address discrimination that Paula has studied, or in this instance, Since right now we're in a situation of having to provide evidence, we are very, very close to a point where any electronic evidence, whether it is photographic evidence or audio recordings, even video recordings, video editing in live time. There are video editing programs that can edit out somebody doing something. So you'll see person A, but in live time, you won't see person B. Do you see where I'm going with this, everybody? All your security cameras mean nothing now because these corporations have developed technology that can invent a voice, make it say whatever you want it to say, and then now you've said that. And you're going to be like, I never said that. That's not me. Well, I don't know. The spectrograph says that's your voice print. No, we don't know all the problems, and we have not a clue what the solutions to these problems are.
But just a second, George.
Go ahead.
I believe that there are solutions there, and I believe it's in our age-old law of due process. That's why when a policeman goes out on a call, he always has to have a signed complaint. So if there's something wrong with that arrest, then the onus goes on to who said they were being harmed. So if you're talking about a court where you're listening to two robots, you've got to determine who is the harmed party. So that's kind of like an original content. In other words, if somebody is going to call a court's legal definition, or what a court is the sovereign and his suit. It means the king doesn't want to just make a decree and without the public and the people understanding that decree. So that if he throws somebody in the dungeon and somebody releases the person from the dungeon, maybe the person is released and kills the king. But if the person who would be inclined to release the person from the dungeon says, I saw your court, I saw your trial, you really are a SOB and you deserve whatever. So if you get the people on your side, the sovereign is more comfortable because, sovereigns are always living under a Damascus, the sword of Damocles, yes. So it means the sovereign and his suit. So the sovereign has been harmed. He's calling the court together, and he wants a determination by the court. He's putting on his show. The other definition is it's where you create a show to show the world that you're right. That's a simpler way to look at it. So public access is important because people need the ability to reach their community, whatever the technology might be. That's why blocking somebody from public access is such a big crime. And those people who have thought it through realizes if you don't have free speech, that's the first step to genocide. So it's my belief that if you follow the money, all these robots are developed by corporations, they have shareholders, and they're figuring out more and more ways to squeeze out more profit. But if you start to see what the cost is always to cover up a Ponzi scheme, in which case you're going to have to, if your fraud is the nature of fraud, it's an illusion. It's not creating anything. So because it's not creating anything and you're still going out spinning the fraud, you've got to keep bringing in more and more investors. But in order to bring more investors in, you've got to pay out the other investors so you keep your reputation going, which means you've got to rape and plunder places outside of the system that you're dealing with. You see where I'm going on this? It's a recipe for war. It's a recipe ultimately for genocide. So what we really should do is completely halt foreclosures. But so few people understand foreclosures, and we're constantly entertained and distracted. It could be foreclosures not just of your home and your real estate. I've told real estate people the reason the internet is 90% dark now is not snuff and porn films, although I'm sure there's nasty things going on. It's foreclosed websites. People like me that can't get on my own website with my own username that I developed, came out of my
Your
own-
intellectual property.
Yeah, my creativity, intellectual property means creation of the mind, not an asset of a corporation. I wasn't working for any corporation when and being paid by a corporation when I developed these ideas. Therefore, the corporation owns it. It was never disclosed that a service provider like YouTube was going to not be a service provider, but be my slave master, and then take sensitive data like you're talking about, my voice, my image, and then reconstitute it in such a way that it could be giving to the public the very opposite message of what I intended, particularly when you're getting involved in things like cancer cures. But I believe the solution is there. You just have to say each IP address is used by a man or a woman. That's not their identity. An email address is used by a man or a woman. That's not their identity. When you give a physical address, that's where you live. You got it with a body. You have to have a place to sleep and to eat and things like that. But now it's so etheric on the internet that you can, it's just a recipe for fraud. But what we're discovering in the courts, and Steve is seeing this too with the Public Service Commission, these are just law firms that are figuring out ways to swindle. But there has to be a check on it. And I believe it's public access producers. You're on.
And, that is a real age-old problem. When you have, I think it was Constitution Man, what's his name?
Carl Miller.
Carl Miller, I think he's the one who uses the term a closed union shop.
Oh, that's actually Rod Class.
Oh, Rod Class. Okay,
The Smith Act.
Yeah. And this is some of what we're encountering in our court. Not some of. This is what we are encountering in Laura's case and subsequently my case as well with the libel and slander suit that's being foisted upon us for defending ourselves. That's a good one. But the idea here is that Mike Gill, State of Corruption, New Hampshire, great YouTube channel, and what he found, and I just want to go into this real briefly, is that he was a top national investigator for solvency when it comes to real estate transactions. Okay, so he had a level of investigative tools and knowledge base that made him privy to a lot of the workings in those financial instruments and in those financial culture. What happened is he made a lot of money. He did well, and he doesn't have any bones about talking about it. He did well. It was as I understand his story, it wasn't exactly the career path he wanted. I think he wanted to be a priest.
Yeah, right.
He started out wanting to be a priest, but so he had a spiritual calling, and in his work in finances as a financial integrity investigator, I mean, that's kind of a spiritual job, really, in a big way. And his wife divorces him. And in the process of the divorce, her team of lawyers and his team of lawyers, it comes to find out, Mike finds out, that these two gangs were actually the same team. They were playing the couple against each other, keeping their divorce proceedings going on and on and on to the tune of $400,000 a month. Mike found himself getting billed. He's like, wait a minute, okay, what's going on here? So what he found out is that it's a closed union shop, that the judges and the lawyers from either side, they're all part of a thing called the Bar Association. All right, the Bar Association is a club, like any other club. It has a clubhouse, it has a membership, it has rules. I'm sure it has secrets and codes and whatever else. And these two teams of lawyers were also involved with a lot of the investigative work that he did in the real estate realms. And what happens is, I think, was it one of his sons, or he got somehow brought into the opiate epidemic during the course of his divorce proceedings or shortly thereafter.
No, I think what it was is he went to prison at some point, contempt of court.
Oh, right.
And when he was in there,
Yes.
they tried to poison him, and a young man in the cell next to him kept yelling for help. And in order to reprimand this young man yelling for help, he was raped and horrible things happened. And Mike saw that close up front, and he also saw how the heroin was coming into the prisons. And he said never again would he forget that experience.
So yeah, I think he took to defending himself. Is that how he ended up in contempt of court? So he threw away the lawyers, started doing his own paperwork and represent. I don't like to say representing himself. He presents himself, self-presenting. Language is very powerful, but in any event, so then he started to do. These guys got a lot of investigative tools, right? So then he starts investigating into these lawyers, and he finds that a lot of these lawyers are representing criminals, and then he starts investigating these judges, and now what he's finding out is wait a minute. What he found out is that New Hampshire is a nexus for drug import and distribution nationally. And this is what he's been exposing, and his life has been threatened, and so on and so forth. But he's been peeling back the onion layers of fraud and more fraud and deception, and one of these federally under investigation and prosecution drug lords was remanded or shifted to a jurisdiction in New Hampshire. And this was a federal case, and I'm not sure, I think it was from Washington, D.C. or whatever, but it was like this big-time drug lord who gets sent to New Hampshire, and then some judge in New Hampshire lets him go. And he goes back to Mexico or wherever, and Mike Gill got wind of this, and it's an absolute outrage that the whole entire legal structure, from the governor and the senators and the representatives and the cops and the federal FBI elements in New Hampshire, all working together with the drug lords and the pharmaceutical companies, because they are involved with the synthetic opiates, and bringing this to crisis proportions in New Hampshire. It's not just the youth, people. Anybody who has pain and gets put on some of these drugs gets addicted to this stuff. And so you have a lot of criminal peoples, how do I want to phrase this? Innocent people getting prescriptions for these kinds of painkillers, and then suddenly they find themselves addicted to this stuff, and they can't get prescriptions, so they have to go into the black market to get their fix. And that's how the ball gets rolling with this particular thing. Go ahead, Laura.
Then you have the rehab centers. $30,000 a month that the government's being billed to rehabilitate people, and it doesn't work. And, it's just a revolving door of ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. He says, wherever money gathers, there these people are. That's what Mike Gill said.
Yes. the reason I'm bringing this up is
Addiction's a business model, in other words.
well, that's a great way to put it. Addiction is a business model, and Joe has some interesting stories about healing addicts in was it New York City?
Yeah, when Joe got back from Vietnam, he was part of a commune, and in this commune, the ladies, they were living in a black section of New Jersey. These young guys started to come to their parties and hang out. And the girls realized some of them had $200, $300 a day heroin habits. So they wanted to clean them up. The boys thought, live and let live. We like pot, they like heroin. But they said, nope, if they want to hang out with us, we got to clean them up. So they said for 2 weeks they couldn't leave the commune, and they could have as much LSD as they wanted and as much pot, but nothing else. And they rehabilitated 20 or 30 of them until finally the chief of police came with a message from the mafia and said, if you continue with your rehabilitation center, the mafia said it's going to firebomb the commune. And that's when Joe shut it down, because he said, the girls couldn't stop. They saw these men addicted, or mostly men is what they're saying. I don't know if there were women involved. But, Tim Leary, Joe was selling LSD to Tim Leary. So he heard Tim Leary tell stories, and Tim Leary was doing studies for the government. Tim Leary was CIA, and he got involved with it until a man named Michael Hollingshead, who turned on the British rock scene, said, unless you've taken LSD yourself, you don't know what you're talking about. So Tim Leary took LSD, and a whole new world opened up for Tim Leary. But he did this study on addiction. At that time, it was just alcohol. I don't think heroin was the issue in those days. And he knew that once he gave the study back to the government, it would be suppressed. So Leary leaked it out to the intellectual community that LSD was curing addictions. So.
Oh, I was just going to ask you to turn my mic down. I need to check something. So
Okay.
I want you to finish your thought while I do something.
Okay. So there's a lot of bad press that goes on about the hippies, and that's something that Joe created his DVD book for. He talks about coming back from Vietnam. He was put into the military at 17 years old, and when he came back from Vietnam, having seen whole villages blow up, he still has PTS over it. But I'm hopeful that even at his age, this can be healed. I'm sure it can. I know it can. I'm becoming a Christian Scientist myself. And the Renaissance was coming into the States and getting involved in the psychedelic scene, which is terribly, terribly misdepicted today. So I was just throwing that in about the heroin thing with Mike Gill. Mike Gill got involved with the heroin problem because his heart was so touched by what he saw in prison. And this young boy had to go through all this hell for calling for a nurse to eventually save Mike from being poisoned to death. Yeah. And that's why Lydia Radin was so fearful to go into prison, even for 5 days. She may not have come out.
There's actually
Oops, just a second. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a statistic out there of prison death, and frequently the prison death is overdose, but it's listed natural causes, things like heart failure.
Right.
And my father once pointed out to me as a military man, well, every death is a heart failure.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a one of their euphemisms, I suppose, that they assign to these kinds of deaths in prison.
And then also to alleviate embarrassment to the family, a lot of the deaths are not listed as heroin,
right.
Which they are.
Well, if you are listing all these deaths in prison as heroin overdoses, then you have a little explaining to do. So there's that as well.
Oh, I actually meant outside.
Oh,
even in the community.
yeah,
outside of
even
prison.
in the communities, there's a lot of non-reporting of actually what's going on. You know, I didn't mean to go off on these tangents quite so wide and broad in this discussion, but I kind of want to wrap it back into the communities of our local churches and their congregations, and really where I was kind of going in my thought on asking you about all of that, Paula, is that with these new kinds of problems that we really don't fully know or understand yet, the phenomena of radiological trespass on biological systems, okay? Microwave, millimeter wave trespass on our bodies affects everybody, every faith, every religion, all of us. It is indiscriminate. It poisons everybody. And that's where, all of these, divisiveness really has got to, get shut down here so that we can start talking to each other meaningfully, not get caught up in cultural differences or religious differences or even political differences, but get down to the nuts and bolts and of the work of determining A, what are the facts, what is really going on and happening to us, and B, let's talk about some solutions. We need some solutions to this, and as Paula, pointed out quite well, there are frequency ranges that are biologically compatible, even healing, that could be accessed and used in this wireless technology. Also, another thing that this YouTube video on these new technologies that mimic humans and mimic their voices and images and real-time video editing is that the wireless technology is not secure, folks. And that there was a man who found a guy intruding in his house, stealing his baby from their apartment. And it turns out that this guy was going up and down streets with a baby monitor, picking up the random baby monitor signals from the different houses. So when you have all of this technology, even as something as innocent sounding as a baby monitor, is a weapon. It's a tool. It's a surveillance tool that is not secure. So all of this wireless technology is inferior in every way, shape, and form to real fiber optic cables, because it is in the airwaves and anybody can hack into it at any time. So I want you to think about these issues, and I really want you to really think about food scarcity, real earth changes happening, solar minimum, all this kind of stuff. But we really do need to talk to each other about a strategy of getting past all the fraud and getting to some truth and then working on it. So I've run out of time here, everybody. I'd like to thank Paula again for helping make another wonderful show, and I'll thank the town of Woodstock for doing some maintenance on these cameras so that we have a nice 3-camera shoot. Thank you very much for that, guys. And Conant Show signing off May 15, 2018, and more to come next week.
Right, stand by.